Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast, one of my favorite guests. I know I say that about most of my guests, but I especially love welcoming Tack back onto the podcast for a check-in on the Russia-Ukraine offensive and also to talk about some of his recent research on the Sahel and other parts of Africa and how geopolitics are affecting Russia's calculations there. He is the chief military analyst at Force Analysis. Highly recommend you follow Sim's work. If you are not, I depend on him for getting a really good sense of what's going on the ground and a lot of different conflict areas in the world, especially the Russia-Ukraine war. He's also apparently an excellent squash player, although I've not been able to test his skills myself. Hopefully one of these days, Sim, I will show you what this American can do. Listeners, if you are interested in the research and consulting services that we offer to clients, if you're interested in our wealth management services, if you're in a family office and you want access to our strategies or access to our advice, all of those are things that we provide. If any of that tickles your fancy, please email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. If none of that does, but you just want to tell me your opinions about the podcast or some book that you read recently, again, standing offer, email me, jacob@cognitive.investments. Happy to chat with you guys about anything. I've actually had a couple really great emails from listeners so far giving me books to recommend and things to check out. So I appreciate that very much. Also, if you're a new listener, if you have not left a rating or a review for the podcast, it takes about 5 seconds of your time. It helps us immeasurably march up the rankings and continue to grow the listenership base and provide even more content that you love. So I think that's everything. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. How's it going, Sim? Welcome to I just used a new podcast platform and he got to see a countdown. But listeners, you don't get any of that. Hi, Sim. Nice to see you.
Hi, Jacob. Nice to see you, and thanks for having me again.
Pleasure is mine. All right, so we're not going to spend the full time on Ukraine because I promised last time you were on we were going to do some Africa stuff too. But before we get to that, let's at least update on Ukraine. We're recording on Monday, July 10th. I'm going to try to push this out tomorrow, so this should be relatively current. But I guess the first question I wanted to ask you so far is, are you impressed with the Ukrainian offensive? Are you unimpressed? Has it gone the way that you thought? How are you? What is your sort of broad takeaway from where things stand today on July 10th?
Well, I mean, I think I'm probably not the only one when I'm saying I'm not necessarily impressed, but I want to make sure to qualify that as, a military operation of this scale is a very complex thing. So, impressing isn't necessarily what you're after. So, yeah, I think if we're looking at what's been happening on the ground, Ukraine has definitely been making some advances. Slow but steady, I guess, is kind of the description of what's been happening over the past month. I think Ukraine has also had to adjust some of its approaches to this offensive following some problems that they ran into earlier on. So I was just reading something the other day about the way that the role of combat engineers has changed. For example, instead of leaning too heavily on armored demining equipment, they're now switching, or have switched at least, to using smaller infantry groups to conduct that kind of reconnaissance and demining ahead of the main advance. So it looks like they've run into some issues as they tried to kickstart the offensive. They've adjusted for it, and at least in some places that seems to be working. We're seeing some advances in the Zaporizhia region, but especially most recently. We've seen some advances just south of Bakhmut, so the area where Russia continued to advance over the winter. That seems to be slowly degrading. And then I think one of the big things to also look at is that, of course, this offensive isn't only happening in terms of how the front line shifts, but there's a lot of effects that are taking place behind the front lines. And I'm specifically thinking about how Russia is, facing continued attrition of its forces, being forced to bring in additional forces from its reserve. We're also seeing, for example, the Akhmat battalions, the Chechen fighters, being brought in to back up forces at Bakhmut. And of course, that raises one of the big questions of whether we'll actually see them fight. But, it shows that Russia is under pressure, that they are losing additional capacity and having to reconfigure their defenses, which is, of course, the first effect that you would want to see in an offensive. Eventually, you do want that to start to create some significant breakthroughs, and I think we're still not seeing that.
How would you define success for Ukraine? So, like, if they don't have any breakthroughs, but they put pressure on Russia for the coming months and take some small territory, I mean, how would you define success here for the Ukrainian counteroffensive?
So that's a very tough question, because I think success in the very first way to interpret that is situated on a very long-term perspective. So eventual success would mean the ability to recover control over Ukraine's territory, to degrade Russian military capabilities to a level where they can no longer be a threat for continued operations inside Ukraine. But if we're talking about this specific offensive, which I guess, people will try to define as the spring/summer/fall of 2023 offensive, then I think to enable those longer-term, higher-level strategic goals, what you would need to achieve is, first of all, to continue to degrade that Russian military capability. You cannot give them a chance to let up, essentially, to start to regather force. Ukraine needs to maintain the momentum. I think that's the biggest point. If we see the conflict turn around again to a phase where the Ukrainian offensive stalls and Russia starts to mount new counteroffensives, then things would be looking very bad, I think.
And how do you rate the sort of readiness of Russian forces right now? Do you think that they're able to mount a counteroffensive? Does this intersect with the Prigozhin melodrama that keeps on happening in Russia? I mean, should Ukraine still be afraid that there's another blow coming from Russian forces after they've done their counteroffensive, or do you think that Russia's forces are spent?
Well, I think we can't say that they're completely spent yet. I think right now the forces that are in the battle space are not in a position to mount such an offensive from the Russian side. But of course, we're already seeing things coming out of Russia with relation to a new round of mobilization. Another 500,000 men or so, at least that would be the attempt, would be gathered, trained up, brought into the conflict. So, over time, depending on how things change on the front line, that there could be new opportunities for Russia to do that. So in order to prevent that, you do need to be able to maintain that constant pressure. If you put Russia in a position where anything that they are able to field is required to maintain the territory they're holding, or to hold back or slow down Ukrainian offensive, you're not giving them that opportunity to actually mount new counteroffensives.
Mm-hmm. I feel like one of the new talking points for Zelensky has been that he's not getting enough of the types of weapons that he needs for the Ukrainian soldiers to really press the offensive in general, which I view as a sign of strength for him. He can push back against the West and say, hey, we're not going to go after this offensive until you give us what we need. Cluster munitions are what are in the news today, and there's a lot of controversy about that. Do you care about cluster munitions? Are there other weapon systems that you think Ukraine really is going to wait on? Do they have the weapons they need to do the job now, and Zelensky is just pulling back? Talk to us about the weapons situation.
So I think the way that the weapons play into that broader strategy is that if exactly what I was saying in terms of the longer term objectives of regaining that territory, being able to maintain that momentum, that is going to require a pretty much constant flow of foreign support to the Ukrainian military, right? At the very least, when it comes to ammunitions, Ukraine is very rapidly depleting everything that is brought into their hands. So there needs to be a constant resupply of that. And I think that's where the cluster munition starts to play a very big role. And I mean, it's a topic worth talking about because obviously there are a lot of ethical questions about the use of cluster munitions. I think if we are talking about their potential use in Ukraine, the way that Ukrainian forces would use these munitions, and then just to kind of sketch for the listeners, we're specifically talking about artillery-fired cluster munitions. So these are not cluster bombs on aircraft that would go and conduct deep strikes into Russia or anything like that. We're talking about cluster munitions that would be deployed by artillery in the immediate vicinity of the front line, right? So one big thing to realize there is that the front line currently consists primarily of completely depopulated areas, right? So a direct targeting of civilian populated areas is not something that would happen with these munitions. Of course, it does significantly increase the burden of cleaning up unexploded ordnance in some later phase of the conflict or after the conflict is over. So there is a humanitarian consequence that is attached with this type of weaponry. Now, on the other side, what providing cluster munition to Ukraine does for them is it opens up an entirely new stockpile of artillery munitions that can be delivered to Ukraine. So Ukraine has been asking for Western artillery munitions ever since they started to get the first Western artillery systems. And, you know, the rate of expenditure of those artillery ammunitions is very high, so they need to ask everything they can. We know that European stockpiles are already or have been running low for quite some time already under the pressure of constantly providing those ammunitions to Ukraine. We also know that the US still has its own military capability to consider potential for conflicts in the APAC region. The US cannot simply provide all of its artillery munitions to Ukraine, but when they can then also tap into this cluster munition stockpile, that provides them with a little more wiggle room in actually freeing things up to send to Ukraine. So in that regard, I think it's a good move. They're going to have to be prudent about how exactly it is used, what kind of guarantees can be made about cleaning up that unexploded ordnance at some later stage. But right now, I think the big thing is that we need to keep the Ukrainian artillery from falling silent.
I try to watch a different country's news every single morning, and today was France's turn in the rotation, so I had France 24 on. And aside from the fact that apparently they're trying to make it so that by 2025 you can bathe in the Seine in Paris, which count me in, I'm ready to go right away. But they focused on these ethical issues with cluster munitions, and I don't know if it's callous of me or whatever, but I'm just kind of like they even use the term just warfare, and my eyes rolled. I'm like, what is just warfare? Like it's a war. Like, you think that either side in Russia or Ukraine is worrying about this? But let me say back what you just said. So part of what you're saying is that the reason that cluster munitions are on the table is because the West can't produce enough artillery ammunition to make up for their depleted stockpiles and for Ukraine's usage. Is that the reason we're digging into the cluster munition belt? Not because they give any kind of advantage to Ukraine on the battlefield?
I have to think that is one of the main reasons, yes. I mean, there is a narrative about additional effectiveness of these weapons, but following the news of these cluster munitions possibly going to Ukraine, I was also looking at some of those statistics about the effectiveness of cluster munitions, and there are some interesting things in there. So there was a study that I saw of the effectiveness of artillery-fired cluster munitions in the Vietnam War, which is, I guess, one of the last high-intensity conflicts where it was used to a very significant degree. So it provides a lot of statistical information. And what that shows is that when compared to regular artillery, not regular necessarily, but non-cluster artillery munitions, is that the number of artillery rounds fired required to achieve a kill, whether that is of personnel or equipment or whatever, it is much greater than it is when they project those same numbers for for the cluster munitions. Now, some people might read those numbers as saying, oh, so cluster munitions are much, much more effective. They're much more likely to achieve effect on target. There's probably some of that, because some of these cluster munitions are specifically designed with shaped charges to take out enemy armored vehicles and things like that, where you could technically take out multiple armored vehicles with a single artillery round, which with the non-cluster munitions is a very difficult thing to do unless they're just stacked up together. So there is some element of that, but then when you look deeper into those statistics, you'll also see that during the entirety of the war, there was a much, much, much smaller number of cluster munitions used than there were non-cluster artillery munitions. So that also begs the question, how was the use of those cluster munitions selected? Were they used specifically in cases where there was a higher burden of intelligence that showed the presence of certain targets? Because if you start to employ them in that way, if you start to use them for specific cases where you have better guarantees of effects on target, then obviously that is going to reflect in those statistics as well. So I think overall, purely technically based on how the weapons work, there is a possibility that they would improve the effectiveness of artillery when used in the right way. But I think at the scale of this conflict, I think it's difficult to forecast that, using this different type of ammunition will suddenly lead to a significantly higher degree of Russian attrition.
Before we leave this topic, just the last time we talked, I remember I think the storm shadows were what you were talking about. Today, everybody's hot and bothered about cluster munitions. Care to venture a guess about what weapons class is next that everybody's going to obsess about that's important for the Ukrainians? Or is there a weapon system you think that they really do need that they're not getting that no one's talking about?
Well, there's another one that everybody has been talking about, but that is just on a very slow timeline, which is the F-16 delivery, right? We've seen advances in the efforts to get the F-16 to Ukraine. So I saw that the Netherlands is essentially transitioning from the F-16 to the F-35 at a faster schedule than they had originally planned to free up those F-16 fighters for Ukraine earlier. They've started training programs, etc. So, I think at this point, we can kind of say the F-16 is coming to Ukraine. We don't know the exact date. That might be, the coming winter. That might be sometime next year. But eventually, when those F-16s get to Ukraine, that is going to have some significant effects. And especially, I think, in terms of providing air defense capabilities, being able to shield Ukrainian operations from Russian air power, from drones, etc. So that's going to be a big one, I think. And then another one that, of course, has also been talked about, and it looks like there's actually some movement coming into that, but the delivery of the ATACMS missile, which I think we've talked about a number of podcasts ago as well, but the larger, longer range version of the HIMARS missiles, which would technically enable Ukraine to target any territory inside Crimea, any of the occupied areas of Ukraine, really. So that would just kind of enhance that capability in addition to the Storm Shadow and in addition to the HIMARS, those kind of munitions that just expands Ukraine's capability to continuously degrade all the logistical connections behind the front line, or to even start to set up a threat of Russian control in Crimea itself, right? Once they fight their way to Crimea, when that eventually happens, being able to suppress operations at the different airfields spread throughout Crimea, being able to target the Crimean Bridge, all of those things or the Kerch Bridge, I mean, all of those things would have significant effects on shaping the battlefield.
Okay. Let's turn this around for a second and talk about Russia a little bit before we get to Africa. First, I know you've spent some time in Russia and have your own context there. Nobody talks to me there anymore. Do you have any idea what the heck happened in the last couple of weeks? Do you have a take, or are you as befuddled as all of us?
I've got some takes, but it is trying to make sense out of very incomplete information, obviously. But I think what some of the narratives are kind of converging on is that, let's start with the things we know, right? We know that Prigozhin was under some significant pressure when it comes to his own power base, in terms of Wagner being one of the main elements of that power base. You have to consider how Prigozhin got to his position leading Wagner, where he was kind of one of the up-and-coming oligarchs, but not really connected to any of the existing Russian power bases. He wasn't part of the Ministry of Defense or the FSB. He wasn't part of the cliques of the other existing energy oligarchs, etc.
No, he was busy making sandwiches for the oligarchs.
Exactly, sandwiches, casinos and sandwiches. That's what he built his empire on. But he was up and coming. He got a little nudge in the back from Putin and those around him that allowed him to massively expand that wealth through government contracts. But I think the way that everything's coming together now, it looks to me like the reason that Putin assigned him the agenda or the portfolio to manage Wagner, as well as the Internet Research Agency and the influence campaign company, is that Russia needed that capability. They needed to establish it somewhere. But I think Putin was afraid to nestle it under any of the existing power bases. So if he would have given that to the Ministry of Defense, he'd have been empowering the Ministry of Defense in comparison to the FSB. If he'd have given it to the FSB, he would have been empowering them with respect to the Ministry of Defense, to Rosgvardia, etc. So he needed a place to put it, and I think that's where Prigozhin kind of offered this nice solution as an Einzelgänger, and he could just run that show without really endangering anyone. Now the problem is, because of the role that Wagner has played since then, and especially in the most recent year in the conflict in Ukraine, its power has expanded massively, right? Wagner had become so key to the ability for the Russian military to actually continue offensive operations inside Ukraine, that Putin kind of became insurmountable as a force in Russian politics. That doesn't mean he was running Russia politically, obviously, right? But he was becoming a player because of that strength that Wagner offered. And that's one of the reasons I think that we saw the Ministry of Defense going after Wagner so hard. And first they started to cut them off from material support on the battlefield, from coordination with other military units. Then they closed off Wagner's avenue to recruit prisoners inside Russia, which became an exclusive right of the Ministry of Defense. And then eventually, in that final iteration in the weeks before the mutiny event, or whatever we're calling it here today, but in the final weeks before that, we saw the MOD push a rule that any contractor working from Wagner or other PMCs would have to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense as well, which would effectively mean that the entire personnel of Wagner would actually be personnel of the Ministry of Defense, which would significantly erode Prigozhin's ability to actually leverage Wagner as a source of power for himself. And so it looks to me like that, of course, was the main threat that caused Wagner, or that caused Prigozhin to plan some kind of a mutiny, or maybe even an attempted coup. Who knows how far the ambitions were really going. But yeah, to kind of wrap up the story, and I'll let you ask more questions to take this in this sensible direction. But I think eventually, when it came to it, when the mutiny happens, it does look like it was triggered prematurely. It looks like some of the military support that might have been there for Wagner was preempted by the Kremlin. We saw a lot of Russian military units and National Guard units kind of step aside as Wagner came through in a lot of areas, which might have been part of a collusion, which might have been them just avoiding conflict on the spot. But it looks like some people within the Russian military were at least beholden to Wagner, if not fully involved in something they were planning. And that doesn't seem to have come together. And at the end of the day, Prigozhin managed to create a sense of emergency and eventually had to back down because I think he didn't have a way to really achieve anything that he might have initially planned.
Do you put any stock in the wild theories out there that this was all planned between Prigozhin and Putin?
I kind of doubt that, because at the end of the day, the one major consequence of this event, and I think we'll still need a lot of time to really figure out what all the consequences of this were, but one of the big consequences is that Putin really looks weak. Putin really looks like he doesn't have control, like he's not able to even deal with the aftermath. I mean, the Russian military failed massively to even stop this, but the one thing that we see Putin doing is holding a hand over the Ministry of Defense, trying not to break what is now the last source of actual fighting force that he has, now that Wagner is no longer part of that. So, if this was planned by Putin, I've got no clue what he was trying to do there.
What is I think the most important question for me is, what do you think the impact has been on the morale of Russian soldiers on the front line? It seems to me that if Ukraine is going to have breakthroughs this fall and even into this winter, it's going to be because Russian troops allow them to have the breakthrough, not because Ukraine is going to be able to punch through based on what they have so far. Have you seen any signals that Russian soldiers are frustrated with the situation, or that Putin's lack of control will translate into meaningful battlefield things? Or is this really just there's going to be a lot of intrigue inside of Russia now as Putin figures out how to try and put some level of control back on his rule?
I mean, there are definitely massive degrees of discontent among the Russian forces. I think there's many reasons for that, most of them not relating to Wagner or the politics in the Kremlin. Just one thing I do want to react to when you say, the success of Ukrainian operations would depend more on the Russian troops allowing it than Ukraine's ability to break through. But the two go hand in hand, of course. The way that Russian troops generally tend to break on the battlefield is when they come under the pressure of Ukrainian offensives, and that's where the question of do I want to die for my country here starts to become more and more prominent in their minds, and might eventually lead them to leave their positions. And I mean, that's something that we've already seen happening. There's been some reports of local desertions and mutinies, or refusals to accept orders in different areas along the front line, even before the Wagner mutiny. So that's something that's going to happen. I'm not sure whether the Wagner situation changes that dramatically. I think it might change it, especially in the areas where Wagner had withdrawn, but that already happened previously to the mutiny, of course. The Wagner forces handing over Bakhmut to the Russian military, of course, means that the Russian military itself becomes a little more responsible for holding that line, comes under additional pressure there. But in the end, I don't think that there's a very immediate effect from the whole Wagner situation on the combat preparedness inside Ukraine. I think we might see that over a longer term, where, of course, removing Wagner from the line, and then the mutiny kind of permanently removed it, I guess. That takes a very significant force of, estimated by some of over 20,000 fighters out of the equation. Some of it will probably be recuperated by recruiting some of those people into the Russian military. One of the things that the Kremlin's also doing is taking some of that heavy equipment that is now taken away from Wagner and giving that to Rosgvardia, which means that some of the Rosgvardia units that are fighting inside Ukraine might have some additional firepower in their fights. How well they'll be able to use that, that's a whole different question. But, at the end of the day, I think we'll see Wagner relocated, reorganized, and possibly, focusing a little more on its foreign operations in Africa and other places, possibly supporting training operations inside Belarus. But I'm not sure that it really touches the direction of the front line in any other ways.
Maybe back to sandwiches. I don't know. For the several Hollywood producers that are listening to this podcast, just know that when you're ready to make Top Gun Ukraine, both Sim and I are available for you as geopolitical consultants to make sure that you get everything right. I'm looking forward to seeing that movie. Sim, let's move to Africa. Wagner Group is obviously connected to this, and there's a headline this morning that Wagner troops in Central African Republic are being pulled out, or it's a rotation, or I don't know. And we know that there's lots of these Wagner Group fighters in the Middle East, in Africa. But I thought maybe we should let's get to that in a second, and maybe just from a broad sort of angle. I mean, I know we're going to talk specifically about the Sahel, which is a part of northern Africa that is particularly lawless and has been festering with jihadist activity and things like that. And I just, for the listeners who haven't thought about Africa or don't think about Africa that much, let's just start with why should they care about what's going on in the Sahel?
Well, I think one of the big reasons that we should be caring about what's going on in the Sahel, especially right now, is the fact that all the different dynamics that have been going on in that region, combined with the events that have been going on in Russia, the Wagner expansion, they've essentially led to a kind of a great power competition over influence in the Sahel. And then that's primarily led by France on the Western side, of course, but we're also seeing the rest of the European Union very involved in that. We see the United States involved in that to some degree, but I think for some years now, the United States has become a little less involved in those efforts, and possibly that's one of the reasons that France has been less willing to also commit more of its own resources to this. But essentially, we're seeing this kind of struggle for influence between Russia and the West. There's China that's playing there as well, but right now it seems like a very aggressive play between specifically Russia and the West, and that kind of causes the Sahel right now to be, on the one hand, a potential source of security risks, where security vacuums are allowing jihadist groups to resettle, to develop capabilities, potentially rebuild trans-regional threats that could directly impact the West. And then on the other hand, of course, we have Russia/Wagner able to establish their power base, their access resources, and kind of advance their geopolitical influence that supports their position in some way when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, and it's a mess. The region is always sort of lawless and a mess. But I mean, if you just look at a map right now, I mean, Sudan has a civil war. Mali has has the coup and its own internal conflict. I feel like every week there's some new jihadist attack in Burkina Faso. Libya is still technically, I wouldn't say that civil war is over. If you want to you can even maybe throw Ethiopia in there. I mean, they're really on the edges of it all. But where do you pinpoint the start of the deterioration of the situation in the Sahel? I have a feeling we're going to go to 2011 and Arab Spring and Libya being the gateway. But is that where it begins? Is this just long-standing and things have gotten worse? How do we benchmark how bad things have gotten in the region?
Well, obviously the history of all of these things goes way further back, as far as we want to, back into the 1800s, when France was also intervening in Mali to fight against jihadist forces. History does actually repeat itself in a very literal way in many parts of the world. But as you say, like 2011, that's a very big marker, kind of establishing. I guess we could say the modern history of the Sahel, of the conflicts, of the jihadist activities in the region. So in 2011, Gaddafi is overthrown in Libya, which kind of does two things, right? On the one hand, it pulls in a lot of forces from surrounding sub-Saharan countries to fight along different sides in Libya. So some of those rebel groups that emerged later in some of these other countries consist of people that were fighting alongside different sides in the Libyan civil war, right? But at the same time, there's also just the massive amounts of weaponry that become available, the things like man-pads and anti-tank weapons being spread around the region, which provide new capabilities to non-state actors that were already in existence, but now suddenly, find a new source of power. And so Mali is the place where that very directly starts to happen very quickly, right? So in 2011, Gaddafi falls, but then very early on in 2012, we see a new Tuareg rebellion emerge. And so just for context, in Mali, there's been a constant lingering conflict between the north of the country and the south of the country, the north being inhabited by nomadic Tuareg tribes as well as other ethnicities, and the south being more its sub-Saharan core of the country, right? So that conflict, that rebellion, causes the military to try and stop the advance of the Tuareg, which at that point are already supported by jihadist groups like Ansar Dine, Mujao, AQIM, so Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. All of these groups, they had their existing networks. They were able to gear up, get involved, exploit the conflict happening in Mali. And then eventually, because of the failure of the Malian military to stop this, Mali itself starts to destabilize. And in just a few months after the conflict starts, in March of 2012, you have the first coup in Mali. The first, well, not the first in history, but the first coup of this modern era, right? And things essentially kind of continue to break down until 2013. In January, very beginning of the year, France launches Opération Serval, which is their own unilateral intervention into Mali to stop the expanse of jihadist groups in the country.
Yeah, were you at Stratfor when Gaddafi fell? I can't remember when you got there.
No, so I arrived at Stratfor late 2012. So a lot of this is bringing back a lot of things. For the listeners, I started off at Stratfor in the Africa team. So when France intervened, I was already there, and I remember when I first joined, there was a lot of talk about a potential planned joint French-German intervention, which eventually didn't happen. France intervened, and then later on, Germany did deploy forces under the UN, etc., into Mali. But yeah, that was kind of the talk of the town when I joined the Stratfor Africa team.
Well, yeah, I was going to say two things. Number one, when you said AQIM, what a powerful sense of nostalgia emerged in my soul. I haven't heard that acronym in a while. Also, though, I was fairly early into my career when I wasn't even a full-time analyst yet. I was doing kind of operation stuff at Stratfor when Gaddafi fell, and that was actually one of the most powerful moments of my career so far, because they literally broadcast him getting beat to death in the streets, and on the one hand, he did a lot of bad things, and on the other hand, like the glorification of him literally getting bludgeoned to death, that like very much affected me and shaped the way that I think about the world going forward. Well, but let's fast forward a bit, because it's obviously not just Libya and Mali. The whole region seems like it's gone crazy. And I don't know, like, is it all connected? Is it really just there's power vacuums and, different forces are trying to move in? I also, the Wagner fighters are famously in the Central African Republic. But when you look at a map, Central African Republic doesn't really look like it's in the Sahel. It looks like it's bordering the Sahel. It looks like more like it's with the DRC, and it has the sort of mineral resources that the DRC has, rather than the sort of empty expanses of the Sahel that allow fighters to move back and forth. But we're talking a lot of desert here. So is there a thread that connects it all, or is it just kind of the region is lawless, it got more violent, and different opportunistic actors are moving in trying to secure whatever they want, and that's where Wagner comes in?
Well, it is definitely connected. And so you're absolutely right, the way that you characterize Central African Republic. You wouldn't traditionally count that as part of the Sahel. But how it is connected to all of these issues is that the security of the Central African Republic, as it was with Mali and it is with Niger, it is with Chad, it is, well, not so much Sudan, but Burkina Faso. So a lot of these countries for a long time have depended on external actors to provide their security or to support them when it comes to fending off coups or rebel offensives. And the main actor in all of these countries was, of course, France. So as France was being pulled into this massive conflict in Mali, you then got a rebel advance in Central African Republic that overthrew Bouzize, and France refused to intervene, partially because Bouzize himself wasn't exactly a friend of the French at that point, partly because, obviously France was looking at a lot of other threats, a lot of other requirements for military resources in the region that they didn't want to dedicate to Central African Republic. But that led to, kind of a destabilization of Central African Republic, new governments coming in place, and eventually, because they couldn't count on France, they started to look elsewhere, and one of the places they looked was Russia. And then it's eventually in 2018, so quite a bit later, that we see Wagner arriving in Central African Republic. 2018 is the same year when Wagner then eventually arrives in Libya, where they start to support the Libyan National Army under Haftar, and that's around the period when Wagner suddenly becomes this actor in Africa, right? So they showed up actually first in Sudan in late 2017 is when there were confirmations of their presence there, supporting Omar al-Bashir, which had also been an embattled local leader that was not getting any support from the West, obviously, right? Under heavy sanctions from the West even. Around this time, around 2018, 2017, Omar Bashir was doing a lot to actually try to get rid of the sanctions, try to re-engage with the West. But, especially when it came to security guarantees, nobody was going to step in there and protect him. So Wagner provided a very interesting alternative to him. And then through Sudan, the Wagner guys eventually got to Central African Republic, where that power vacuum allowed their services to be in need. And then eventually from there, they continued to advance. And I think for a long time, we saw them kind of situated primarily around Libya, Sudan, Central African Republic. But then after continuous coups in Mali, and especially as France was starting to bring down its own operations in Mali, there was a lot of anti-French sentiment in Mali, which of course was also fanned by those Russian influence operations, including the Internet Research Agency under Prigozhin, etc., kind of preparing the grounds. And then eventually in 2021, Wagner also arrives on the ground in Mali, right? So they kind of expand into West Africa, that part of the Sahel, and now some of the questions are still rising about Burkina Faso, which has been in a similar position as Mali since some of the coups that occurred in the country. So they had two different coups in 2022, which brought military leaders to power that have some links back to Russia. They've said, Russia is our big security ally. It's not the West. In early 2023, Burkina Faso ended French operations inside Burkina Faso as well. So France had already withdrawn completely from Mali, but they were still able to conduct special operations, attacks against jihadist groups inside the territory of Burkina Faso. So Burkina Faso ended that. And there's been a lot of speculation about potentially Wagner entering Burkina Faso. There's no public confirmation of that. There's no evidence of it. Though I've heard rumors of people that have been on the ground of Burkina Faso that definitely Russians are on the ground in Burkina Faso, whether they are primarily engaged in influence operations or, setting up some kind of Wagner military presence. That is yet to be seen, I guess. But one by one, these different countries are kind of falling away from French and Western influence and being taken over by Russian interests. And at this point, I guess it's kind of Niger and Chad that are the two countries that are still cooperating closely with the West, that are receiving a little more security guarantees from the West. I don't know if you remember, but in 2019 there was a rebel advance into Chad where France actually did decide to intervene, right? So when they have to make these choices, the whole, this whole history is a list of decision points for France where it has to choose: do I intervene? Do I not intervene? They chose to intervene in Mali because of the massive jihadist threat. There was a real threat of a caliphate being established there in quite a large ungoverned region. So that forced them to intervene. In Central African Republic 2013, they chose not to intervene. But then Chad 2019, they do choose to intervene. They go in and they conduct airstrikes against these convoys that kind of immediately shut down the advance of these rebels. And an interesting thing about these rebels, by the way, their acronym is FACT. So they are the FACT rebels, FACT. But these guys have been located in Libya for a very long time. So these guys had been part of the mercenary groups that had been fighting along different sides of the Libyan conflict. Then after 2014, when the LNA initiated their Operation Dignity, these groups were opposed to the LNA, so there was some fighting between the FACT rebels and the LNA until at some point they actually kind of made peace with each other, and essentially that led the FACT rebels to support the LNA in their fight against ISIS within Libya. It caused the LNA to have a safe place to develop their own capabilities, and according to some French journalists, even received training from Wagner while Wagner was there in Libya. So, all of these connections, they keep coming back. The rebels then enter Chad. The French conduct airstrikes to ward that off. Eventually, those rebels come back with another advance into Chad in 2021. And that's when Idriss Déby, who had been president for a very long time, supported by France, gets killed allegedly on the front lines in fighting with these FACT rebels, right? So it's all a very interconnected story around this whole Wagner French versus Russian influence. But that's essentially what's shaping the region. And Sudan falls a little bit outside of that pattern because they don't have that French history. They don't have that the French colonial legacy that puts them in the same position as a lot of these other countries. But because of their own history in supporting Osama bin Laden at some point in the 90s, in having a relationship with Iran, etc., they had also become completely isolated from the West. And all of this is creating a massive fertile soil for Russia to actually establish influence, and for Russian actors, at the very least, to gain access to a lot of resources inside Africa. And we're talking mining gold, mining diamonds, but also running local industries like coffee, beer. They're getting their hands on anything they can to try and get some kind of wealth out of Africa.
Well, I wanted to put a finger on that because I have trouble establishing what Russia's interests are here versus Wagner Group's interests, because I get why Wagner Group wants to do a modern day Heart of Darkness story and be the rulers of, Africa. We've seen countless warlords try to do this over time. But most of the countries you're talking about are landlocked countries that can't produce anything at scale or do anything that's going to move the needle for the Russian economy or for Russia's strategic position. Libya, we can talk about the Mediterranean. Even Sudan, we can maybe talk about, access to the sea and the Mediterranean, things like that. But Central African Republic, it's well named. Like, it's double landlocked almost on all sides. Like, is Russia really getting anything out of this, or was this just a Prigozhin type taking advantage of the fact that he got all these Russian dollars and Russian Russian rubles, and he got Russian weapons, and he needed someplace, an outlet for some of his for his mercenaries and things like that. And now that Wagner is pulling out, I mean, I would assume that Russia's forces have to be focused on Ukraine right now. Does Russia really have the bandwidth to continue being this great power in the region? You talked about France. France has basically turned its back on the region because it's hugely unpopular in France to do so, and they probably don't have the troops to pacify the region anyway. So it doesn't seem to me that Russia's going to either.
No, exactly. And I think, we should definitely not expect Russia to be able to pacify the Sahel. I think that's already a given. It's a very good point. We got to separate the interests and the role of the Russian state and the activities of Wagner. So I think a lot of the activities of Wagner in Africa have been very profit-driven. So they entered Sudan as they were establishing mining companies there. So Russian mining companies were being protected by Wagner forces. At the same time, there were some contracts with the government. So they're kind of, stretching across those different functions there. But it seems that a lot of that focus is on Wagner making money from mining. There's a lot of money to be made there, though. Gold mining, diamond mining across this entire region. When it comes to the Russian state, however, a lot of these countries that are enticed by the Wagner capability, the Wagner presence, they also end up setting up a lot of defense political agreements with Russia. So the Wagner surfaces become like a sweetener for Russia's own political influence, right? And that means, and even though the effect might be limited, but when you look at voting in the UN, for example, when the General Assembly is voting on things relating to the conflict in Ukraine, etc., Russia has this African army to actually lean on. That will vote against or abstain from certain votes in favor of Russia. So that diplomatic effect, that's got some level of importance. But I think in addition to that, we should not forget the potential advantages that Russia gets in terms of geographic positioning. Because even though these countries, as you say, they are primarily landlocked. Sudan is maybe the one exception to that. It's factually the exception to that. But Sudan offers that influence in the Red Sea, the potential of hosting Russian vessels in the Red Sea. There's been a lot of talks about the potential Russian naval base in Port Sudan as well. We've yet to see that happen, but that would be another position that allows Russia to extend its naval presence beyond the Suez Canal, right? Russia's naval strategy on a global scale is all about overcoming choke points one by one by establishing new lily pads where they can actually support their operations from. So Sudan plays some importance in that regard. But even the rest of the Sahel region, even when it comes to countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, the fact that Russia is able to establish a base of power there means that it becomes much more difficult for the West to operate in areas like that, because every time that Russia is able to expand its presence, its influence in these countries, it starts to bleed over. And, I don't want to say domino effect, but I'm saying domino effect. But after Mali, Burkina Faso started to lean towards Russia. After Burkina Faso started to have protests against French forces, against the French, we already started to see protests against the French inside Niger. So, will eventually Niger fall to this anti-Western / Russian influence as well? And that means that it becomes very difficult for the West to operate there. And even though, we're not back in the 1800s where the West is vying for territorial control over colonies in Africa, Africa does still matter. And at the very least, in the sense of jihadist groups being active there, non-state actors that are not being controlled by local authorities, that are not going to be controlled by Russia, eventually those are going to pose threats that the West is going to have to deal with. And if you no longer have the ability to go and deal with them on the ground in Africa, that puts you in a very defensive, reactive position. So that in turn, of course, provides Russia with leverage over the West, because Russia will be able to essentially tell the West, we could help you here, but you're not being so kind to us in other places, so why would we, right?
Mm-hmm. I'll get you out of here sort of on this, because, and I'll put if you're watching this podcast on YouTube, we'll put a map up. If not, at this point in the podcast, if you're not driving, you might want to look at a map of Africa right now just to get a sense of what we're talking about. But it seems to me, I mean, you call it, all right, we went from Mali to Burkina Faso to Niger. We've got Central African Republic, Chad. The next line of countries are Nigeria, Cameroon, Ethiopia, places like this. And northern Nigeria has also had its fair share of militancy, and it's affected oil production and things like that. And we can get into an interesting academic conversation about how we get from French colonial Africa to English colonial Africa and the ways that changes and things like that. But do you think that this has implications beyond the Sahel? Because it looks like these problems are starting to actually come out of the Sahel and affect major cities or major points that start to get into I don't want to say the more economically productive parts of Africa, where the real wealth is, where the real population centers are. Do you worry about this kind of stuff bleeding over into a Nigeria or into a DRC or into even a Uganda? Or is that, this is like the Sahel, we're really talking about this lawless region here, and it's still very important, but it's not going to come outside of a sort of predetermined geographic range?
Definitely. It's something that I think is a very significant risk. One of the countries that you mentioned, actually, Cameroon, is already kind of slipping into the Russosphere to some smaller degree, because they're definitely not positioned as a very active French supporter anymore. But Wagner companies or Wagner associated companies operating in Central African Republic are actually conducting a lot of their business exporting goods, etc., through Cameroon. So not through Sudan, but they're actually going through Cameroon, where they also have local companies set up to deal with logistics. So at the very least, Cameroon is hosting some of that logistical activity that supports the Wagner presence in the wider region. When it comes to Nigeria, Nigeria itself is kind of an interesting question. I don't necessarily see Russia immediately build up a lot of influence inside Lagos, etc., and actually, pull Nigeria into its side of the geopolitical spectrum. But one of the things to remember is that Nigeria is still facing that Boko Haram violence up in the north, which, by the way, also touches on Niger. Some of the Western security operations in Niger are not necessarily geared entirely against the jihadist groups operating in Libya, Mali, and Burkina Faso. That's kind of their western flank. But on their southeastern flank, they have Boko Haram, which has also tried to encroach on Difa and other locations inside Niger. So one of the main things that I fear actually in this region, and I remember speaking about this back when I was at Stratfor with some of the other Africa analysts at the time, but the potential for these two jihadist areas to actually meet up in Niger presents a very significant risk. If Niger falls, you get one large, long, wide-stretching area from, all the way from the Libyan deserts all the way down to northern Nigeria, and that becomes a problem for Nigeria, because then they're no longer just fighting this Boko Haram group, which, even though it still exists, I would say, we've seen times when they were a much greater threat than they are now. So the potential of Niger falling in any kind of way, of the security capabilities being reduced there, whether it is by having the Western forces removed, whether it is by bringing in different less effective methods being pushed by Russia, that could cause a significant security vacuum across a very wide region that becomes problematic for everyone around it. So that's, I just want, sorry, you mentioned Cameroon and Nigeria, so I wanted to tackle those. But I think we should also be aware when it comes to other areas of Africa, we've also seen those Russian influence operations target other countries, or even Wagner. We've seen Wagner back in 2019 deployed to Mozambique. They were only there for a couple months before they apparently gave up because it didn't really work that well for them. But we've also seen them in Madagascar back in 2018, kind of around that period of massive Wagner expansion into Africa. Wagner forces were sent there to protect the then president and to protect some mining interests that Russian companies set up at the time. That president did not get reelected, so that hasn't really expanded much further beyond that. But they have been trying this. And then on the Russian state level, countries like Rwanda, DRC, even South Africa are always getting a lot of attention from Russian diplomatic efforts, Russian military agreements. So Russia is definitely looking at a much broader scale beyond the Sahel, and they're looking at an approach across the continent. But I just think that because the Sahel has this imminent security risk, and kind of the local tiring of being tied to Western interventions and the political limitations that come with cooperating with the West at this point in history. I think that the combination of that has just led the Sahel to be so much more attractive and effective for that Russian strategy than other parts of Africa.
Yeah, we'll have to put a pin in it there. We haven't talked about China. We haven't talked about Turkey, which runs around in this mess. And you mentioned Mozambique. I believe Total is restarting their big LNG natural gas export operation, and the DRC is obviously where most of the cobalt in the world comes from. So, but I don't need to get on that soapbox right now about electric vehicles. So we will say, Sim, hopefully you'll come back in a couple months, and we will check in on the war and Africa and anything else that's on your mind. Thanks for making the time, man.
Gladly. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.